Okay, Tommy, it is good to see you once again.
Hello, how's it going? Happy Tuesday. Well, no, I shouldn't say Tuesday because I don't know when this is going to drop. What day of the week will this drop?
I have no idea. It depends on
Happy day of the week.
happy day of the week whenever this drops. But it's indefinitely recorded on a Tuesday. So happy Tuesday to anybody that does see this on a Tuesday.
Fanrific.
Fanrific. All right, we're gonna talk about guitar's favorite nerd who has the world's most famous and famously reproduced guitar signature Les Paul. All right, so
Oh,
this guy
that was
was an inventor. He was an
is
amazing.
this product placement? What is it?
Oh yeah. All right. Don't want to go for the big cup today, so that's all I have. Hey Gibson, I so definitely would do product placement for you guys.
You are barking up the wrong tree with them.
Definitely, I'm like too small and not famous enough, but can always dream big.
There you go.
Can always dream big. So let's talk about this guy, Tommy. Um, I'm pretty sure the only thing I'm going to be able to say in this interview today is that he invented multi-track recording when somebody brought back from World War II the tape recorder, and he invented multi-track recording with his song Lover. Other than that, he's got a guitar model that is extraordinarily loved, extraordinarily reproduced, and I'll just leave the rest to you from here.
Well, we are going to have to spend quite a lot of time on the multi-track recording thing. That is more important than I think people realize. But yeah, Les Paul is actually, it's not his real name. His name is Lester Paulsfuss. Um, and he was born in 1915. So he was still playing, just to put it into perspective how old he was and how long he was at it. He was still playing up until he died in 2009. The guy was born in 1915, and he just kept at it. He had a residency here in New York City and was just still active. You gotta love that. But yeah, Les Paul was a remarkable person because he was an innovator since he was a kid. Basically, he was always tinkering with one thing or another. And we've talked before on this show about how necessity is proven to be the mother of invention, especially when we're talking about how technology was kind of keeping up with the musician demand as the rock and roll era progressed. Les Paul was coming up in like the 30s and the 40s when this stuff wasn't just in its infancy. I mean, it practically didn't exist. People were recording direct to discs, to acetates. He got interested in electric guitars out of a desperate need just to be able to be heard because he started out as an acoustic guitarist and people couldn't hear him. So he would do nutty shit like put like a phonogram needle taped to the body of his guitar wired up to sound system just to try to get the sound to be louder. And then we talked before when we talked about the Les Paul guitar about how in the 40s he was experimenting with what he dubbed the log, which was basically just a big post that he carved into a neck and the center of a body, like basically what we would know as a BC Rich neck through. He kind of made that and then stuck body wings on the sides of it so it didn't look completely ridiculous, but he just cut them off of another guitar, just stuck them on there. And that's what he took to Gibson to try to get them to make a guitar for him. And they weren't interested until years later. But the guy was constantly messing around with stuff. Yes, you mentioned multi-track recording. We definitely need to dive into that in depth. But he was also the person who started experimenting with flanging effects, phasing effects, tape delay in the studio, just all stuff that we take for granted, and it's on every recording ever. This guy was experimenting with in the home studio that he built in his garage, and I find that incredible He just never ever stopped tinkering. And on top of all that, as far as musicianship goes, he was absolutely incredible. I don't know if you've ever done any kind of deep dive into his catalog, but when you listen to the man play, it's remarkable. The dexterity and how nimble his fingers are. And he's playing so clean, like the most pristine, clean tone possible. And it's just gorgeous in his hand. You can listen to him, he's just flying around the fretboard. It's like an angel. I mean, it's really incredible to listen to. So, I mean, you want to talk about a modern day renaissance man, that Les Paul absolutely was.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly, it's like Django Reinhardt precision.
Who was one of his huge influences too.
Yeah, a lot of those early. Ooh, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of people that are still around that have that clean precision, and that's
It's rare.
young person, younger, not necessarily young, but younger person's got that type of precision would probably be Johnny Lang. Other than that, I can't think of anybody else. It's really just the old guys where you hear them never miss a note.
Yeah, you find this primarily in jazz guitar scenes where that kind of playing is highly prized. And of course, Les Paul was a jazz guitarist that had big crossover success in the pop market with his music in the 50s. But he was absolutely the classical definition, in my opinion, of a jazz guitarist. And he dabbled in country playing and he dabbled in blues playing. But when you listen to his playing, that is like iconic, ideal jazz chops right there.
100%. What got him started on like in the jazz scene overall?
Well, that was just what was hot. You play what's in, man. You play what's in. Remember, we look at jazz as kind of a niche thing because it's been niche for decades now. You know, it kind of peaked in the 60s, it had a huge peak. And also it was hot in the 30s and 40s. But you know, it spent most of its time being underground niche music that wasn't mainstream. But when Les Paul was coming up, it was all the rage. You're going to get into what's all the rage. I mean, it's basically as simple as that.
This was like the pre-rock and roll type of music.
Oh, for sure. Well, because remember, he was messing with his electric guitar experimentation in the 1940s during World War II. You know, that's the era of, you know, the Andrews sisters and Glenn Miller and all that stuff. You know, we're talking definitely before rock and roll, before R&B became mainstream, before any of that. That's when this guy was peaking then. You know, his first records came out 49, 50, 51. Definitely pre-rock and roll era.
Now, um, I'm guilty as charged about not knowing too much about electric amplification. Um, but I, as far as the little res or as far as what I've been able to dig up, um, it really was the late 30s when we start looking at when people began creating amplifiers for their guitars. Did it start with Rickenbacker?
That's debated. That's debated. I don't know that I buy that. I feel like this was kind of one of those things where, and we'll touch upon this when we get to Les Paul's experimentations with multi-track and effects in the 50s too. But the idea of multiple people kind of coming up with an idea at the same time based out of necessity. And I think that's really the case with electric guitar amplification. This was clearly a need. Music was moving in that direction. Again, like what I mentioned about Les Paul needing to be heard, he was not alone in this. You know, as bands were getting bigger and more people were going to see live music, you just couldn't hear the acoustic guitar player. There was a demand for this. So it wasn't like one person somewhere came up with the idea, electric guitar and an amplifier and revolutionized the whole world. Like people were trying to move in that direction and find ways to kind of make this possible, just different ways of getting there. So I don't know that I'm really. willing to give credit to any one person or company.
All right, that's what I was looking for. Was someone a trendset or was it just invention out of necessity? Um, and Les Paul cuts his chops as a jazz musician mostly, or what's hot?
Well, he also, like I said, he also dabbled in country. I should actually amend my statement about his first records being in the late 40s, early 50s. He actually did cut some singles, I believe in the 30s, under a different name, doing country stuff. So, I mean, I mean, this dude goes way back. But yeah, primarily it was jazz.
So looks like I'll have to do some record searching later. Try and find some not heard of before Les Paul tracks.
Oh, they're out there. They're out there. And you can actually get even some readily available stuff like the first couple of albums that he put out as proper albums are like Les Paul and his trio. And it, it's fascinating listening to that versus what came immediately later with his experiments with multi-tracking. The difference in sound once he started working with Mary Ford and all that. It's a dramatic shift. But you can get like a taste of early Les Paul on those first couple records. There's one that's all the sounds of like Hawaii and stuff like that. It's pretty cool stuff.
Cool, cool. I'll have to. Like, I think the Sons of Hawaii I've heard before, but I'll have to double check now. Um, so what happens? Does anything happen in between, this at the end of World War II and the point at which he starts to experiment with multi-track recording?
Well, in terms of in his personal life, I mean, he was in a bad car accident at one point. Um, in the late 40s, he almost lost his arm.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if you knew about that. Yeah, they were saying they couldn't set it, and it was either he goes somewhere else for treatment or they have to amputate.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it almost came to a stop before it all really kicked off for him in the 50s.
Well, it was good that nothing that I didn't lose that arm.
Yeah,
So
yeah, they had to set it at like a weird angle and like leave it there for like I don't know, like months or something like that. It was pretty crazy. Yeah, that could have been pretty close. Yeah, he and Mary crashed. They went off like a 20-foot ravine or some crazy thing in the car. Like it could have been fatal. They could have both died.
yeah, yeah, definitely. It's a good thing that they both lived and that they're fine. They carried on to
Yeah.
so.
But
Um,
in terms of that time period, though, I mean that he was this was a furiously experimental period in time for him, and it's what led to him eventually getting the multi-track recording process underway. Like, so all right, so what he would do, and I'm going to try to make this so it's understandable for people who don't know or care that much about recording technology, but it is so fascinating, and this is what I really want to focus on here. So in the late 40s, what he started to do is he started experimenting with multi-tracking in an extremely primitive way. Now, I had mentioned earlier in this episode that recording had been done on acetate, direct to disc. So it would look like a vinyl record, but like you'd be able to cut it right then and there. And a lot of recording in recording studios was the whole band would have to set up. Everyone was mic'd up live. Everything was all in one big room, and you'd have to get everyone positioned just right and get everyone, their volume just right and facing the right way so that it sounded good going to one mono capture device, which was just an acetate machine. So a lathe that would cut to an acetate, and you had to have a technician whose job was to monitor that the entire session. And you basically would cut the whole thing live one time straight through, and now you had it physical. There it is. It's done. And if you needed to take another take, you throw that away and you have to get another acetate and you do it again and you do it, wash, rinse, repeat over and over and over again until you got the damn thing right. And then from that, they would make the stampers, the platers, all that stuff that you would use to actually press up like 78s and whatnot. Now, one advantage you could say to this was that it forced people to be on their game because you weren't going into a recording studio unless you had the talent and the ability to actually maybe hopefully get everything right in one take. So when you were recording people, you were recording extremely talented individuals.
Yep, with primitive technology that was probably all equipment was beaten up, and
Oh yeah.
chances
Yeah.
are the technician was drinking the whole time.
And wearing a lab coat because that used to be a thing. So this was how people were recording. Now, there was a guy in the military in World War II, and I'm forgetting his name, unfortunately. I'm blanking on that. I apologize. But he had gotten a hold of a couple of German tape machines, reel to reel machines, which were just single track. Okay. And he brought them home with some other stuff and approached, I think it was Ampex Corporation, about developing this. And it was the idea was this was going to revolutionize recording in this country. And he worked with Bing Crosby because he got a meeting with Bing Crosby, who immediately seized upon this and recognized its possibilities for him to be able to record his radio broadcasts in advance using this reel to reel machines. And it just took off like, wildfire. Now, Les Paul in his garage, in his home studio in his garage, was experimenting with multi-track recording of his own, but he was doing it extremely crudely. And what he would do is he had an acetate machine, a lathe, and he would record himself direct to the acetate, and then he would play the acetate and play along with it while recording that to another acetate. And he would keep stacking and stacking and stacking this way. And of course, you had generational loss as you kept doing this because the original first track, that first thing you recorded, has now been re-recorded and re-recorded and re-recorded. But he would be able to stack himself playing. And I believe it was the comic W.C. Fields. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was W.C. Fields that heard one of Les's experiments and said, "You sound like an octopus." Basically saying it sounds like he's an octopus playing multiple guitars at once. But he was doing this extremely crudely by just, it's kind of like the equivalent of when you were kids and you would want to make your own mixtapes and you're holding one boombox up against the other boombox, kind of like that. That's basically what he was doing, but with acetates. And every time he would record himself on another acetate, he'd then play along to that while cutting to another acetate, boom, 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 boom. And if you screwed up at any point in the process, you were screwed. Um, so once he got a hold of one of those reel machines, what he did is he modified it. Now, I'll explain how this works. So a tape machine has three heads. Okay. So the tape, magnetic tape, physically goes across what are called heads, which are basically these like aluminum looking blocks that just touch it. Okay. Now, as the tape goes through, the first head it hits is the erase tape, the erase head. And that's erasing literally anything that goes through there. So it's going to be recording onto a blank tape. The next head it hits is the record head. And after that is the playback head. That allows you to actually monitor what you're recording because you hit the record head first, and then you could hear it right back coming off the playback head. And if you want to just listen back exclusively, you would obviously just go into playback mode and you're not going to have the record head enabled or the erase head enabled. You're just going to listen to what's on the tape. So what Les Paul did, this is very early on, they're talking like late 40s, is he modified one of those machines by adding another playback head first in the chain before the erase head. So what this allowed him to do is the same thing he was doing with the acetates. He would record onto this single track reel to reel, and then he would play it back in record mode. And the first thing that would come out, he'd be able to monitor from that playback head before the signal hits the erase head. So then he can listen to what's on there and take that signal and join it with him playing more parts. And that would get recorded onto the tape. But this was extremely destructive because it was erasing as it went through. So if he didn't get it right, he lost everything he worked on. So then what eventually he started to do is he got a second machine and he would record onto one, play back on that, play along to it, and record himself and the previous recording onto the new machine and keep bouncing back and forth and back and forth. And then eventually he got the idea, what if we could do this all in one machine? And instead of having it just be one track across the whole surface of the tape, it became multiple tracks. And you basically divide the tape up lengthwise into strips. And in this case, it was an 8-track recording process across probably a 1-inch tape, I believe. So it would divide that 1-inch tape surface into 8 individual track strips. So the playback, record, and erase heads all were multi heads, which you could actually hit all 8 of those strips at one time. So you can record onto one strip and then play back and record onto another strip, play that back, record on another strip, and boom, then we have modern multi-track recording. This is so critical to music as we know it. And what he did was really awesome stuff. He didn't just multi-track himself and create little guitar symphonies and make it sound like he was 4 or 8 guitar players. If you listen to those Les Paul and Mary Ford records, and by the way, her name is not actually Mary, it's Iris, but that's, it's no one
It
used it.
just doesn't even matter. It's
The
she's
whole
just an
thing. Yeah.
iris.
Yeah. So if you listen to those records, they were very inspired by the Andrews sisters, but it's all Mary because they were multi-tracking Mary, and Mary would sing the lead parts and then she would harmonize to herself by overdubbing. So they were creating multiple Marys and multiple Les Pauls on those recordings with multi-track recording.
Okay.
I hope I didn't lose people with this, but it's really important to know this stuff.
Okay. So, in other words, he created a tape where there was 8 strips within it, and you could record on each strip, allowing you to have a plethora of recordings, making it a simpler process. So he invented the very early on re-recordable tape.
Well, I mean, the tape was already re-recordable,
Yeah.
but and I want to be clear. I don't want people to get the wrong impression. It's not that Les Paul was manufacturing multi-track machines in his garage workshop, but he was pioneering these processes and pioneering what you could do in a studio setting with multi-tracking, and then worked with Ampex to help develop this thing.
Okay. So he's the early tinkerer
Yeah.
of and so and with this too, he was able to without the need of having like nowadays we talk about how bands or musicians would do these recordings. Like as an example, there's a one UK singer, Sam Smith, and every time you hear Sam Smith's voice, uh, what sounds like a small choir, he's recording him. He's his voice has been recorded multiple times. Um, and this is something in the digital age that happens with a lot of vocalists, but this was kind of like that very start of it.
Yes, it was. Yes, it
Okay.
was. It revolutionized the recording industry. And it was also very, very expensive technology. And while in this country we had 8-track recorders as early as the 50s, in other countries they did not really get popular over there right away. So when you look in, for example, at in the 60s, all those revolutionary albums that the Beatles were doing, like Sergeant Pepper was done with 4-track machines that they would have to sync up and then kind of bounce back and forth from, because even at Abbey Road Studios they did not yet have machines quite as advanced as the ones we were using in this country.
So helping propel American tech that much further as well.
Yeah.
A huge jump for our tech boom that we had in the 50s.
Oh, for sure. Now, while he was also experimenting with multi-track recording, as I mentioned earlier, he was also doing other stuff to experiment with effects that you can get out of using tape recording. And that was flanging, phasing, and tape echo. And he would do cool stuff. I mean, flanging effect is when you have two sounds that are basically so similar, but like they're kind of slightly out of sync, and you get that kind of warbly kind of you know the flange effect. And
Yeah,
he
it almost sounds like chorus, but it's not really chorus. And it's something that
exactly.
people that guitar players like Eddie Van Halen's most famous for.
Mhm.
And that's interesting because I thought Jimi Hendrix was the guy who invented that with like Electric Ladyland album.
No, no. You can hear Les Paul doing flange effects as early as 1952. Yes, as early as 1952 is when he started hitting with that on one song in particular. But yeah, it goes that far back, and we have Les Paul to thank for that. And also, he was experimenting with tape echo, because the way you would get echo or reverberation basically is you would either have a plate reverb, which was a huge plate that would kind of vibrate as you sent the signal into it, or you would build like an echo chamber, which would basically be a huge room that would be tiled with reflective surfaces designed in such a way that it would bounce around, and you'd actually stick a mic in there with speakers, and you'd send the signal in there to capture the echoing around. I mean, just really crude stuff that also sounded quite incredible. But he was able to do it with tape machines, and basically playing with the distance between like the different heads. Like if you had a machine sitting on the opposite side of the room, and you could figure out how much delay time you wanted. If one machine's over here, one machine's over there, and how much length of tape was going to go between them, and how much delay that would cause, and then record that delay. I mean, you've seen them before, like echoplexes are basically doing that all in one little box, but they would do that experimenting with like huge tape machines, like physically distant, like apart from each other, to get tape echo that way.
Nice, nice, man. Uh, Les Paul. That's some high grade nerd shit. He managed to do in the 50s. Um, that permanently changed rock and roll. So I honestly thought James Hendricks was the guy that, or Frank Zappa, yeah, Frank Zappa would have been the kickoff, and instead we're getting all of these and as early as the 50s, everything that roughly we would see largely within the late 70s in rock and roll.
Well, it stands to reason that people would think this because, well, think about it. You know, you got a guy like Les Paul, the music he's putting out in the 50s and in the 60s wasn't really reaching the people that grabbed the ball and ran with it with as far as rock music goes in the late 60s and early 70s. But what he was doing is he was having an enormous influence on the recording industry. People in the know knew about Les Paul, they knew about what he was doing. And then you get a guy like Hendrix comes along, and he takes all these effects and he uses them on his records. And those records blow everybody's minds. And they're like, what is he doing? How can I get that sound? I mean, it kind of stands to reason, but they're not going back and they're not referencing a Les Paul and Mary Ford record from 1953 and saying, what is he doing? How can I get that sound? That's not what they're going for. They want to sound like Jimmy.
Yeah.
And they're not really asking questions. Where'd Jimmy come up with this idea? You know, who hipped him to this?
Yeah, that's the funniest thing is back then people were never asking like, "Hey, well, where'd you get these ideas from?" We're,
Yeah, it just sounds like he's playing guitar on Mars. I want to sound like that. And it's no knock on innovators like Jimi Hendrix, Frank Zappa, any of those guys, because what they were doing was just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, it's light years away from where Les Paul was at with the instrument. They took it to a whole new place. but they were utilizing innovations that he came up with in the 50s as
Yeah.
part of their secret sauce.
A secret sauce. Okay. Pretty remarkable. Um, Now, all right, he made multi-track recordings. It completely changed the way we record with 8-track machines, helped push us technologically further. Um,
Like so he would just do stuff like even though he wasn't inventing necessarily a new process, he would like build his own version of it, things like that. So he's
his
got a
own
long,
homemade.
yeah, he's got a long history of all homebrewed stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if you were to actually, if it were possible to take a virtual tour of his actual studio that was in his garage that he built. It wouldn't really shock me if 50% of the stuff in there was stuff that he built his own version of.
His
I mean, he
own
was
version.
that kind of guy. So even if he wasn't necessarily inventing some entirely unheard thing, he would build his own version of something that may have already like existed or some technology that was still in its infancy. And he's like, I'll build my take on that kind of thing. Because
Yeah.
that's who he was.
Yeah. No, that's something definitely to take note of, that he was just that guy that was always tinkering and toying around, and he never stopped, even right up until towards the end of his life. He's still an active musician. He's still working. He's still doing things. He never quit it.
No, he never quit it. I have tremendous respect for people like him because I consider them people who are permanently curious and they just want to know more. They want to learn, they want to explore, they want to experiment, they want to push. And, here's a guy who basically changed recorded music as we know it in the 50s and then kind of experimented with semi-retirement in the mid 60s after the divorce with Mary and then just came back and was like, no, I'm gonna make more albums and I'm gonna just keep playing. And he did some records in the 70s with Chet Atkins, and he just never stopped, man. He just never ever stopped. And towards the end of his life, the dude was deep in his 90s, and you could still go see him at a club in New York City, playing live, doing it for real. And I think it's just a beautiful thing, somebody who could have just completely stopped after the 50s and be like, well, I've left my stamp on the entire world. I'm good now. I'll just fade off into obscurity. He's like, no, I have more music in me. And he just went and he just charged forward for another half a century, making more music.
I love that about him. I love that. He just didn't stop at
No.
no point. Still, that even if it wasn't that he did anything, I don't know. I guess I'm always paranoid I'm gonna miss something. Even if we didn't, he didn't do anything where it was like, okay, he changed he brought three effects to an instrument that permanently changed it, and uh, each effect alone is its own multi-million dollar industry. Um, obviously had his stamp on American technology and global technology, period. Um, but uh, this guy was a profoundly active musician. He was one of those guys like BB King or Ozzy Osbourne, who's like, "You're gonna have to pry my cold dead body off the stage."
I mean, pretty much, man. Pretty much. He's just one of those guys, and you just can't help but love that. Um, and like any number of the things that he was responsible for innovating, um, you could very easily make the argument that if it hadn't been him that did it, it was gonna end up happening. There was eventually going to be multi-track recording. I can't see that being a thing that didn't happen. I can't see us doing one track recording in the 80s. It was gonna happen. We were gonna end up discovering these different effects that you can get from manipulating magnetic tape. It was gonna happen at some point. Um, but here it was one guy that messed with all of that stuff. And I think that's just incredible. you know? So even if we would have eventually gotten there, this one dude messed with all of that. And
And
I
it
think that's
was a
incredible.
jazz guitar player in his garage.
Yes.
That to me is probably the most American story right there.
I mean, it really is.
It was some technology picked up from World War II, and it was something that a guy did in his garage. That just is what makes it even that much better.
Yeah. Using technology recovered from Nazi Germany.
Yes, yes, that was used by a scientist. So instead of having to write the notes down, he could just speak it right into the machine, and he could listen to it later. So he wouldn't keep forgetting. He had a chronic forgetting issue. I remember this in my media history, one of my media history classes.
Yep.
Um, yeah, is there anything else you would like to say or share, Tommy, before I think we might close this up?
Uh, gosh, I guess the only thing I would say is if you think you know about masterful guitar playing from all the greats we've talked about before, you need to check out Les Paul's work, and it's going to blow your mind. It's a completely different approach to the instrument than what you might be used to if you're coming from the Eddie Van Halen school. But my God, could Les Paul play? There's a reason his name's on the damn guitar. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. All right, thank you again, Tommy.